Chapter 1. The Universe's Favorite Idiots. So here's the thing about humans, and I mean this in the most scientifically accurate way possible. We're basically the universe's equivalent of that one cousin who shows up uninvited to family reunions, eats all the good snacks, and somehow ends up burning down the garage while helping with fireworks. The Galactic Council had been watching us for about 300 years, ever since we figured out how to stop dying from paper cuts and started launching ourselves into space with the subtlety of a brick through a cathedral window. Most civilizations, when they achieve faster-than-light travel, do so with elegant quantum tunneling or dimensional folding. Humans? We basically strapped rockets to bigger rockets and hoped really hard. Primitive but determined was how Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Collective described us in his official report, which, coming from a species that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a tax auditor, was probably meant to be diplomatic. Captain David Dutch Vanderberg stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's first proper warship, watching the swirling blue-green marble of Earth rotate slowly beneath them. At 34, Dutch had already lived through humanity's awkward teenage phase of galactic citizenship. The first contact fumbles, the translation errors that nearly started 3 separate wars, and that unfortunate incident where a human diplomat accidentally proposed marriage to the Andromedan trade minister during what was supposed to be a routine agricultural negotiation. "Sir," came the voice of Communications Officer Lisa Reeves, "we're receiving a transmission from Galactic Council Station Harmony. They're asking if we want to join something called the Protected Species Initiative." Dutch turned from the viewport, his weathered face splitting into what could generously be called a grin and pessimistically be called a warning sign. "Protected species? What are we, endangered pandas?" "Apparently, sir, it's a program designed to help developing civilizations integrate safely into galactic society without the trauma of premature military conflict." Reeves paused, consulting her tablet. "They're offering to provide orbital defense platforms and a peacekeeping corps to handle any issues." "Issues," Dutch repeated slowly. "They want to put us in cosmic daycare." From the tactical station, Lieutenant Commander Alex Rourke looked up from his sensor array. Rourke was the kind of guy who could calculate orbital mechanics in his head while arm wrestling and somehow make both look effortless. "Sir, the readings I'm getting suggest these peacekeeping corps ships pack enough firepower to glass a continent. That's not protection. That's occupation with extra steps." Dutch nodded thoughtfully. "The thing about humans is that we've got this peculiar talent for recognizing when someone's trying to manage us. It's probably because we've been doing it to each other for millennia. Reeves, send a polite response. Tell them we appreciate the offer, but we're good, thanks." "Should I mention that we've got our own defense initiatives in development?" "Nah, let's keep that between us and the home team." What the Galactic Council didn't know, and what Dutch wasn't particularly eager to share, was that humanity had spent the last 50 years not just building ships, but weaponizing everything that wasn't nailed down and seriously considering a few things that were. When you're a species that figured out how to make explosives out of agricultural fertilizer and household cleaning supplies, you tend to approach the concept of space warfare with a certain creative enthusiasm. Chapter 2. Cosmic Kindergarten. The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom, had developed what they called the Graduated Integration Protocol, a fancy way of saying, "We'll hold your hand until you learn to play nice with the other kids." It was, by all accounts, a perfectly reasonable system that had successfully shepherded 47 species into galactic civilization without a single major conflict. The problem, of course, was that nobody had asked humanity if they wanted their hands held. Ambassador Veltar stood before the Council's Central Assembly, his chitinous frame gleaming under the artificial light of Station Harmony. Behind him, a holographic display showed the Sol system, with Earth highlighted in what the Council probably thought was a cheerful shade of blue, but looked suspiciously like a targeting reticle. "Honored councilors," Veltar began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from having 6 arms and enough bureaucratic experience to strangle red tape with your bare appendages. "The human species presents us with a unique challenge. Their technological development follows patterns we have not previously encountered." Councillor Tharang of the Methane Worlds raised one of her sensory stalks. "In what manner, Ambassador?" "They appear to have skipped several traditional developmental phases entirely. Most species achieve interstellar flight, then develop defensive capabilities, then gradually advance to more sophisticated weaponry over several centuries. Humans achieved interstellar flight while simultaneously developing weapons that seem designed to cause maximum psychological impact, rather than tactical efficiency." A murmur ran through the assembly chamber. The council had seen a lot of weird stuff over the millennia, species that communicated through interpretive dance, civilizations built entirely on gas giants, races that had achieved enlightenment through aggressive meditation. But psychological warfare as a development priority was new. Their ships, Veltar continued, are festooned with what appear to be purely decorative elements that serve no functional purpose except to look. He paused, consulting his notes. The technical term their diplomats used was scary as hell. Behind Veltar, the hologram shifted to show the UES Defiance. To be fair to human engineering, it was a beautiful ship, all sleek lines and efficient curves. But someone, somewhere in the design process, had made the decision to add what looked suspiciously like fangs to the front section and paint flames along the hull. The overall effect was less advanced starship and more flying motorcycle gang. Furthermore, Veltar added, their diplomatic responses to our protected species initiative have been unconventional. The hologram switched to display a text message. Galactic Council Station Harmony. Thanks for the offer of protection. We're good, though. We've got this. Also, would you like to buy some really cool fireworks? We make excellent fireworks. Regards, Earthka. Seriously, our fireworks are amazing. Counselor Zeph High of the Crystal Mines spoke next, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns. They offered to sell us fireworks? Apparently, Veltar said with the tone of someone who had spent too many years in diplomatic service. They consider pyrotechnics to be a valid trade commodity. Our xenobiology team believes this may be related to their species' unusual relationship with controlled explosions. Controlled explosions? Thorang's stalk swiveled toward Veltar with obvious concern. Yes. They use them for entertainment, excavation, mining, propulsion, and what they term gender reveal parties. Our analysts are still trying to determine what gender has to do with explosives, but we believe it may be ritualistic in nature. The council chamber fell silent. Somewhere in that silence, you could practically hear the collective realization that maybe, just maybe, they had bitten off more than they could chew. Chapter 3. The Galaxy's Worst Babysitters. What the Galactic Council failed to understand, and what would, in hindsight, prove to be a catastrophic oversight, was that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history being really good at two things: pattern recognition and creative problem solving. Usually while someone was trying to kill them. So when the Peacekeeping Corps showed up in the Sol system with a fleet of 12 dreadnoughts and a mandate to provide orbital security, Dutch and his crew were already 3 steps ahead in a game the Council didn't even realize they were playing. Sir, Reeves called from her station, the Peacekeeping Fleet is requesting permission to establish orbital platforms around Earth, Luna, and Mars. They're also asking for a complete inventory of our defensive capabilities. Dutch was silent for a long moment, staring out at the approaching alien vessels. They were impressive ships, elegant, efficient, and intimidating in the way that only truly advanced technology could be. Each one probably carried enough firepower to reduce Earth's surface to glowing slag. You know what, Reeves? Let's give them exactly what they asked for. Sir? Send them our complete defensive inventory. Every ship, every weapon, every platform. Make it official. Lieutenant Commander Rourke looked up from his station with obvious confusion. Sir, that's going to show them how outgunned we are. Our entire fleet is maybe a dozen ships, half of which are converted cargo haulers. Dutch's grin was the kind of expression that had historically made insurance companies nervous. Rourke, my friend, you're thinking like someone who plays by the rules. The thing about humans is that we're really good at finding new rules. The transmission that went out to Peacekeeping Corps Command was a masterpiece of technical honesty and strategic misdirection. Peacekeeping Corps Command. Per your request, please find attached complete inventory of Earth Defense Forces. 12 active warships, various classes. 847 orbital defense platforms. 2,947 surface-to-orbit missile installations. 1 lunar mass driver. 15,847 civilian vessels, various purposes. Miscellaneous defensive systems, classified. Thank you for your interest in Earth security. Regards, Captain Dutch Vanderberg, UES Defiance. What the transmission didn't mention was that orbital defense platforms included everything from actual military installations to commercial communications satellites that someone had optimistically labeled as dual-use technology. The surface-to-orbit missile installations were mostly repurposed cargo launchers with attitude adjustment issues, and the miscellaneous defensive systems category covered everything from actual weapons to Dutch's personal collection of really aggressive fireworks. But the real genius was in the civilian vessel count. 15,000 ships sounded impressive until you realized that it included everything from interplanetary cargo haulers to the weekend warrior types who had converted their personal yachts for asteroid prospecting. Which was human for, I wanted a spaceship and convinced my spouse it was a business investment. Admiral Kethvar of the Peacekeeping Corps read the transmission 3 times before calling an emergency briefing. 15,000 civilian vessels? His aide, Commander Ziktar, consulted his tactical display with obvious confusion. Sir, that's larger than most military fleets. Exactly, Kethvar said slowly. Either humanity has militarized their entire civilian population, or they're completely insane. The truth, as these things often are, was a little of both. Chapter 4. Creative Accounting. The thing about humans is that we've always had a somewhat flexible relationship with categories. Ask any tax accountant, insurance adjuster, or customs official. We can take a perfectly reasonable classification system and turn it into something that resembles origami made from legal documents and held together with wishful thinking. The Peacekeeping Corps discovered this 3 days later when they attempted to establish their security perimeter around Earth. Admiral, Commander Ziktar's voice carried the kind of stress usually reserved for natural disasters and family reunions. We have a problem. Admiral Kethvar looked up from his tactical display, where red dots representing human vessels were multiplying faster than a computer virus with commitment issues. How many problems are we talking about? All of them, sir. The humans are, well, they're everywhere. The holographic display zoomed in on Earth's orbital space, which looked less like a defensive perimeter and more like the galaxy's busiest shipping lane. Vessels of every conceivable size and description moved through the area in patterns that defied both traffic control and common sense. Sir, Ziktar continued, we identified what appeared to be a cargo freighter approaching Luna. When we hailed them for inspection, they identified themselves as the Lunar Waste Management Collective and claimed to be hauling fertilizer. And? Sir, our scans indicate that their cargo hold contains 17,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, aluminum powder, and what their manifest lists as really good sulfur. Kethvar was quiet for a moment. In his 3 centuries of military service, he had learned to recognize certain warning signs. Industrial chemicals in those quantities, traveling together, generally meant one of 2 things. Either someone was planning the galaxy's most ambitious agricultural project or someone was planning the galaxy's most ambitious boom. Did you ask them about this? Yes, sir. Their response was, and I quote, yeah, Luna's got a real problem with soil quality. We're gonna fix that right up. Make it real fertile, if you know what I mean. I'm beginning to suspect I do. The display shifted to show another vessel. This one approaching Mars. Sir, we also intercepted this transmission from the Martian Geological Survey expedition. A human voice crackled through the comm system with the kind of cheerful enthusiasm usually associated with people who have found something shiny or explosive. Control, this is Captain Torres aboard the Red Planet Special. We've got a full cargo load of high-grade mining charges, 17 cases of blast gel, and enough det cord to gift wrap a mountain. ETA to Martian orbit in 6 hours. Oh, and tell the wife I found that thing she wanted. Turns out industrial diamonds make excellent projectiles if you accelerate them properly. Kethvar felt what humans would probably call a headache coming on, despite the fact that his species didn't technically have heads. Commander, how many of these civilian vessels are carrying what could be considered weapons? Ziktar consulted his tablet with the expression of someone discovering that their insurance premiums had just tripled. Sir, based on our scans, all of them. All of them? Yes, sir. Even the ones that appear to be legitimate civilian transports are carrying cargo that could be weaponized. We found a passenger liner whose kitchen stores include enough sodium metal to level a city block if properly motivated. There's a research vessel carrying something called experimental polymer compounds that our chemistry AI flagged as potential explosive precursors. And there's a ship calling itself the Solar Tour Guide Service that appears to be hauling a cargo hold full of asteroids. Asteroids? Yes, sir. When questioned, the captain explained that they run authentic asteroid mining experiences for tourists. Apparently, people pay to operate industrial mining equipment in asteroid fields for entertainment. Kethvar stared at the tactical display, watching the dance of human vessels around their home system. Slowly, a terrible understanding began to dawn on him. Commander, he said carefully, I don't think we're looking at a civilian population. Sir, I think we're looking at a military force that doesn't know it's a military force. Chapter 5. The Diplomatic Incident. The situation might have continued in this vein indefinitely. with the peacekeeping corps growing increasingly nervous, while humans cheerfully went about their business of accidentally militarizing everything they touched, except for the arrival of the hegemony. The hegemony was what happened when a species achieved technological superiority, and then spent the next few millennia getting really, really bored. They were, by all accounts, a perfectly reasonable people, right up until they decided that the galaxy would be much more interesting if everyone else was either dead or enslaved. They approached conquest with the methodical efficiency of accountants and the moral flexibility of telemarketers. Their fleet appeared at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday, which was either excellent timing or terrible timing, depending on your perspective on galactic politics and the human workweek. "Sir," Communications Officer Reeves called out, her voice tight with the kind of professional calm that usually preceded very bad news. "We're receiving a transmission on all frequencies. It's a surrender demand." Dutch looked up from the tactical report he'd been reviewing, a fascinating document that detailed how the Asteroid Mining Collective had accidentally discovered that high-velocity rock impacts made excellent impromptu weapons testing. "A what now?" "Surrender demand, sir. From something calling itself the Fourth Hegemony Fleet. They're demanding immediate capitulation of all human-controlled territory and, let me get this right, the transfer of all useful biological specimens to hegemony processing facilities." "Processing facilities," Dutch repeated slowly. "That sounds ominous." Lieutenant Commander Rourke pulled up the long-range sensors, his expression grim. "Sir, we've got 47 capital ships on approach, escorted by what looks like 300 smaller vessels. They're big, they're armed, and they're not here to discuss trade agreements." Dutch was quiet for a moment, staring out at the stars. In the distance, he could see the running lights of peacekeeping corps vessels holding their security perimeter. Admiral Kethvar's fleet was impressive by any reasonable standard. 12 dreadnoughts with enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Against 47 hegemony capital ships, they were about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. "Reeves," Dutch said finally, "get me a channel to Admiral Kethvar. Then patch me through to Sol Defense Command, Luna Base, Mars Colony, and the Asteroid Mining Collective. Oh, and see if you can raise the Tourist Bureau. I think Captain Torres might want to hear this." "Sir, what are you planning?" Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that had historically made enemies reconsider their life choices and allies start looking for insurance policies. "I'm planning to introduce our new friends to something we call asymmetric warfare. But first, we need to have a chat with our babysitters." The channel to Admiral Kethvar crackled open a moment later. The Peacekeeping Corps commander appeared on the main screen, his insectoid features tight with obvious stress. In the background, Dutch could see the controlled chaos of a military command center preparing for a battle they couldn't win. "Captain Vanderberg," Kethvar began, "I assume you've detected the approaching hegemony fleet." "Oh, we've detected them all right. 47 caps, 300 escorts, and what our tactical AI is generously calling a really bad day." "Admiral, I'm going to be straight with you. Your fleet can't handle this." Kethvar's limbs twitched in what Dutch had learned was the alien equivalent of a grimace. "We are aware of the tactical situation. The Peacekeeping Corps will, naturally, fulfill our mandate to protect Sol System civilians. We will hold the line as long as possible to allow for evacuation." "Evacuation?" Dutch laughed, and there was something in that sound that made Kethvar's skin crawl. "Admiral, with respect, you're thinking like someone who fights fair. Humans gave up fighting fair around the time we figured out that throwing rocks was more effective than throwing punches." "Captain, I don't understand." "Admiral," Dutch interrupted, "how many civilian vessels did your scans detect in this system?" 15,847, Kethvar replied automatically. "And how many of those vessels are carrying cargo that could be weaponized?" There was a long pause. "All of them." "Right. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to pull your fleet back to Earth orbit and establish a defensive perimeter around the planet. Make it obvious. Lots of energy signatures, active scanning, the works. Draw their attention." "Captain, that will accomplish nothing except getting my ships destroyed more efficiently." Dutch's grin was now approaching legendary status. "Admiral, trust me. You're not the weapon. You're the distraction." Chapter 6. The Thing About Humans, the Hegemony. Fourth Fleet approached the Sol system with the kind of methodical precision that came from having conquered 47 star systems and encountering exactly 0 effective resistance. Fleet Commander Vex High had been doing this for longer than some species had been sapient, and he approached each new conquest with the professional detachment of someone who had turned planetary subjugation into a science. His tactical display showed the expected defensive setup. A small fleet of what appeared to be Galactic Council peacekeeping vessels clustered around the third planet with orbital installations and what looked like a token resistance force. It was, by all reasonable standards, a textbook defensive arrangement that would provide exactly the kind of hopeless last stand that made for good propaganda footage. Commander. His aide, Sub-Commander Rithval, consulted his tactical readouts with obvious boredom. We're detecting approximately 12 capital ships in defensive formation around the primary inhabited world. Standard peacekeeping course configuration. Estimated engagement time to total victory, 14 minutes. Any signs of the local population attempting evacuation? None, sir. In fact, we're detecting increased traffic throughout the system. It appears they're attempting to conduct normal business operations despite our arrival. Vexhai considered this. In his experience, species typically responded to hegemony arrival in one of three ways: immediate surrender, futile resistance, or panicked evacuation. Continuing normal commercial operations while being invaded was new. Sub-Commander, what kind of normal business operations are we detecting? The usual, sir. Cargo transport, passenger service, what appears to be some kind of mining expedition, and... Rithval paused, consulting his sensors with obvious confusion. Sir, there's a ship approaching our outer perimeter that's broadcasting a general transmission. What kind of transmission? They appear to be... advertising, sir. Something about authentic space combat experience tours and once-in-a-lifetime orbital bombardment viewing opportunities. They're offering to sell tickets. Vexhai felt the first stirrings of what humans would recognize as unease. They're selling tickets to watch their own conquest? Yes, sir. The transmission includes pricing information and what they term battle photography packages. They also mention something about refreshments being available. Refreshments. Yes, sir. They specifically advertise the galaxy's best combat rations and artisanal explosive demonstrations. The thing about predatory species is that they develop very good instincts for recognizing when something is wrong. Vexhai had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of planetary conquest, and his intuition was telling him that something about this situation didn't fit the pattern. Sub-Commander, run a detailed scan of all vessels in this system. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with. Sir, that will take several hours. We have nearly 16,000 contacts. 16,000? Vexhai's translator couldn't quite convey the tone, but it came close to what humans would call alarm. I thought you said there were 12 capital ships. There are, sir. The rest appear to be civilian vessels of various types. But, sir, Rithval's voice took on the careful tone of someone delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. Our preliminary scans are detecting some unusual cargo configurations. Unusual how? Well, sir, there's a passenger liner whose manifest lists recreational mining supplies. Our chemistry scanners indicate that their cargo hold contains 17,000 tons of what appears to be high-grade explosive compounds. For recreation? Yes, sir. There's also a research vessel carrying something called experimental propulsion systems that are generating energy signatures consistent with antimatter containment. A cargo freighter hauling what they list as agricultural supplies that appear to be enriched uranium. And approximately 40 vessels carrying what they term geological samples that are actually asteroids ranging in size from small buildings to city blocks. Vexhai was quiet for a long moment. Sub-Commander, in your professional opinion, what are we looking at? Sir, either this species has the most dangerous civilian population in galactic history, or we just invaded a system where the entire population is armed with improvised weapons of mass destruction. On the bridge of the UES Defiance, Captain Dutch Vanderberg listened to the intercepted hegemony communications with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who have just solved a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. Rourke, he called to his tactical officer. Are you getting this? Yes, sir. They sound concerned. Good. Fear is a useful emotion. It makes people make mistakes. Dutch turned to his communications officer. Reeves, open a channel to all civilian vessels in the system. Time to let everyone know the party's starting. The transmission that went out on all civilian frequencies was brief, cheerful, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Attention all vessels. This is Captain Vanderberg, Sol Defense Command. We have uninvited guests who've made some very rude demands about surrender and processing facilities. I think it's time we showed them what hospitality looks like in the Sol system. All vessels with mining charges, please report to your designated sectors. All vessels with volatile cargo, prepare for creative applications. All vessels with big rocks, remember that velocity equals accuracy. And remember, folks, we're not just defending our homes here. We're about to teach the galaxy why you don't mess with humanity's kids. Chapter 7. The Orphanage. What the Hegemony Fourth Fleet didn't know, and what was about to become tragically relevant, was that 3 days earlier, their intelligence division had made what seemed like a minor targeting decision. Among the installations they had marked for priority neutralization was something called the New Geneva Children's Sanctuary, located on Luna. It wasn't a military target. It wasn't even particularly important from a strategic standpoint. It was an orphanage, one of several that had been established throughout the Sol system to care for children who had lost their parents in the various accidents, illnesses, and misadventures that came with being an aggressively expanding spacefaring species. The New Geneva Children's Sanctuary housed 847 kids between the ages of 3 and 17. They had a small school, a recreation center, and a modest hydroponic garden where the older children learned about agriculture, and the younger ones learned about the profound satisfaction of growing things in space. It was, by any reasonable standard, exactly the kind of place that civilized species avoided bombing. The hegemony was not, by human standards, civilized. The attack came during what humans call the lunch hour, when most of the children were in the main dining hall sharing what the staff optimistically called nutritious space food, and the kids more accurately described as barely edible protein paste. The hegemony bombardment was precise, efficient, and thorough. 3 antimatter torpedoes that reduced the facility to atoms in approximately 0.3 seconds. The transmission reached every human vessel in the system simultaneously. Dutch was reviewing tactical reports when Reeves's voice cut through the bridge chatter with the kind of flat, emotionless tone that usually preceded very bad news. "Sir, we're receiving an emergency transmission from Luna Base. The New Geneva Children's Sanctuary has been... They're gone, sir." The bridge of the UES Defiance fell silent. It was the kind of silence that had weight, the kind that pressed down on everything and made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. "Gone?" Dutch's voice was very quiet. "Direct hit, sir. 3 antimatter warheads." There were no survivors. Dutch stood very still for a long moment, staring out at the distant lights of the hegemony fleet. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that came from making a decision that could not be unmade. "Reeves, open a channel to Admiral Kethvar." The Peacekeeping Corps commander appeared on screen a moment later, his insectoid features tight with what looked like grief. "Captain, I assume you've received the reports about the Luna facility." "I have." Dutch's voice was very soft. "Admiral, I'm going to ask you to do something, and I need you to trust me. Pull your ships back. All the way back. Get them out of the inner system." "Captain, I cannot abandon..." "Admiral." There was something in Dutch's tone that made Kethvar stop talking. "They just killed 847 children. They didn't target military installations or strategic resources. They targeted kids. Do you understand what that means?" Kethvar was quiet for a moment. "Captain, I'm not sure I do." Dutch's smile was nothing like the expression he'd worn earlier. This was something colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. "It means we're not fighting a war anymore, Admiral. Wars have rules. This is something else entirely. What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to introduce the hegemony to a concept we call total war. It's what happens when you take away everything that makes humans civilized." Dutch paused, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "Admiral, get your ships clear. What's about to happen isn't going to be pretty, and I'd prefer not to have friendly casualties when we demonstrate why you don't hurt human children." Chapter 8. The Galaxy Learns Something New. The transmission that went out to every human vessel in the Sol system was different from the earlier broadcasts. There was no humor in it, no casual banter, no cheerful enthusiasm. When Dutch's voice echoed through the comm systems of 15,000 ships, it carried the kind of cold fury that had historically preceded very bad things happening to very deserving people. "All vessels, this is Captain Vanderberg. By now you've all heard about New Geneva. 847 kids, 3 to 17 years old. They had names, favorite foods, pets, dreams about what they wanted to be when they grew up." His voice paused for a moment. "The hegemony decided those children were military targets. Throughout the system, on cargo haulers and passenger liners, on mining ships and research vessels, on luxury yachts converted for asteroid prospecting, and tour boats offering authentic space experiences, humans stopped what they were doing and listened. Now I know what you're thinking," Dutch continued. "We're civilians. We're merchants and miners and tourists and scientists. We're not soldiers. But here's the thing about humans. When someone hurts our kids, we stop being civilians. We become something else entirely." On the bridge of the cargo freighter Luna's Pride, Captain Isabella Reyes looked at her manifest of agricultural supplies and smiled in a way that would have made her grandmother, who had served in 3 different Earth wars, proud. In the engine room of the passenger liner Stellar Dreams, Chief Engineer Bobby Chen ran calculations on how much antimatter their experimental propulsion systems could produce if properly motivated. Aboard the research vessel Scientific Progress, Doctor. Victoria Foster looked at her cargo hold full of geological samples and began plotting intercept courses with the kind of mathematical precision usually reserved for doctoral dissertations. Throughout the system, 15,000 civilian vessels began to move. The hegemony thinks they're fighting a war. Dutch's voice continued. They think they understand the rules, but they made one critical error. They hurt human children, and humans who are protecting their young don't fight wars. They fight something much more personal. Fleet Commander Vex High watched his tactical display with growing alarm as the human civilian vessels began changing course. What had been a seemingly random pattern of commercial traffic was suddenly resolving into something that looked suspiciously like a coordinated attack formation. "Subcommander?" he called, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from recognizing that the situation had fundamentally changed. "What are we seeing?" Subcommander Rethaval consulted his sensors with obvious confusion. "Sir, the civilian vessels they're all moving toward us. All of them. All 15,000? Yes, sir. And sir, we're detecting massive energy buildups throughout their fleet. It appears they're arming weapons systems we didn't know they had." On Vex High's tactical display, red dots were converging from every direction. It looked less like a battle formation and more like the closing jaws of some massive predator. "Sir," Rithaval continued, his voice rising slightly, "we're also detecting some kind of coordinated transmission among the human vessels. It appears to be... music? Music? Yes, sir. Our translation AI identifies it as something called the Ride of the Valkyries. It appears to be some sort of human war song. Through the speakers of 15,000 human vessels, Wagner's composition echoed through the vacuum of space. Not as sound, but as synchronized radio transmissions that created a ghostly harmony audible only to those listening on the right frequencies. It was, by any reasonable standard, completely unnecessary and utterly terrifying. Chapter 9. Creative Applications. The thing about asymmetric warfare is that it relies on using your advantages in ways your enemy doesn't expect. Humans, as it turned out, had several advantages that the hegemony hadn't accounted for. First, there was the sheer number of vessels. 47 capital ships might be able to handle 12 peacekeeping corps dreadnoughts, but 15,000 targets approaching from every possible vector presented what military theorists politely call a target-rich environment problem. Second, there was the cargo. When your entire civilian population happens to be hauling industrial explosives, radioactive materials, antimatter containment systems, and city-sized asteroids as part of their normal business operations, you have what amounts to the galaxy's largest improvised weapons stockpile. Third, and most importantly, there was creativity. The hegemony was accustomed to fighting opponents who played by the established rules of galactic warfare. Ships that fought other ships, weapons that were designed as weapons, tactics that followed recognized patterns. Humans, as was about to become clear, had never seen a rule they couldn't find a creative way around. The attack began with the cargo freighter Luna's Pride, which had been hauling what its manifest listed as 17,000 tons of agricultural enhancement compounds. Captain Isabella Reyes had looked at her cargo of ammonium nitrate, aluminum powder, and sulfur, and made a decision that would have impressed her demolitions instructor back at the Seoul Defense Academy. "This is Luna's Pride to all vessels," her voice crackled over the comm system. "I am beginning my attack run on hegemony vessel designation Hotel Alpha 7. All vessels, observe and learn." The freighter accelerated toward the hegemony destroyer with the kind of suicidal determination that suggested its pilot had stopped caring about personal survival and started caring about making a very emphatic point. But Captain Reyes wasn't planning to ram the enemy ship. That would be wasteful, and humans had learned long ago that waste was inefficient. Instead, as she approached the destroyer's point defense perimeter, she did something that no military manual had ever considered. She jettisoned her cargo. 17,000 tons of agricultural enhancement compounds scattered through space in a rapidly expanding cloud. For approximately 3 seconds, it looked like the galaxy's most expensive fertilizer accident. Then Captain Reyes fired a single flare into the cloud. The explosion was visible from Mars. "Holy!" came a voice over the comm system that Dutch recognized as belonging to Captain Torres of the Red Planet's Special. Did she just turn farming supplies into a nuclear weapon? "Technically," came the calm voice of Dr. Victoria Foster from the Scientific Progress. "That was a fuel-air explosive with approximately 47 times the yield of conventional ordnance. Very impressive chemical engineering." The hegemony destroyer that had been designated Hotel Alpha 7 was no longer designated anything, having been reduced to its component atoms by what the official report would eventually describe as innovative agricultural application. All vessels, Dutch's voice cut through the chatter. You have just witnessed the proper use of agricultural supplies. Let's see what we can do with the rest of our cargo. What followed was a masterclass in creative destruction that would be studied in military academies for the next 1,000 years. The passenger liner Stellar Dreams, captained by someone named Captain Valdez, who had apparently been a demolitions expert before entering the tourism industry, demonstrated the proper application of experimental propulsion systems by using their antimatter containment unit as a directed energy weapon. The blast carved a hole through 3 hegemony cruisers in a row, like a cosmic cue ball with anger management issues. The research vessel's scientific progress lived up to its name by proving that asteroids, when accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light using civilian-grade particle accelerators, could achieve what Dr. Victoria Foster cheerfully described as kinetic energy yields equivalent to strategic nuclear weapons. The asteroid that had been designated as a geological sample punched through a hegemony battleship like a bullet through tissue paper. But perhaps the most creative application came from Captain Singh aboard the tour vessel Cosmic Adventures, who had been running authentic asteroid mining experiences for wealthy tourists with more money than sense. Singh looked at his cargo hold full of paying customers, all of whom had signed liability waivers and paid premium prices for the opportunity to operate industrial mining equipment, and made a decision that would have made his insurance company weep. "Attention passengers," Singh announced over the ship's intercom. "Due to current circumstances, today's mining expedition will be conducted against military targets instead of asteroids. Anyone who objects to this modification can request a full refund. Everyone else, please report to the equipment bay. Today you're going to learn how industrial mining lasers work against enemy hulls." The wealthy tourists, it turned out, were absolutely delighted by this development. Within minutes, the Cosmic Adventures had become the galaxy's first passenger vessel to offer live combat mining experiences, with paying customers operating high-powered industrial equipment against hegemony ships, while Singh provided running commentary. "Excellent work, Mrs. Patterson. You've just carved through their main reactor housing. Mr. Williams, try adjusting your beam focus. We want to disable their weapons, not tickle them." The Hegemony 4th Fleet, designed to handle conventional military opposition, found itself completely unprepared for an enemy that turned industrial accidents into weapon systems and treated warfare like a particularly violent form of entertainment. Chapter 10. The Mathematics of Mayhem Fleet. Commander Vex High watched his tactical display with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. In 30 minutes of combat, he had lost 18 capital ships and 63 escort vessels to what his computers insisted on categorizing as civilian commercial traffic. "Sub-Commander," he called, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome revision. "What is our current tactical assessment?" Sub-Commander Rithival consulted his displays with the expression of someone who had discovered that mathematics no longer worked the way they expected. "Sir, we are being engaged by approximately 14,700 vessels of various classifications, all of which appear to be armed with improvised weapon systems of unprecedented destructive capability." Improvised weapon systems? Yes, sir. Our tactical AI has identified the following weapon types: agricultural explosives, industrial mining equipment, scientific research apparatus, antimatter containment systems used as directed energy weapons, kinetic projectiles consisting of asteroids accelerated to near relativistic speeds, and... Rithival paused, consulting his readouts with obvious confusion. "Sir, there's a passenger liner that appears to be using its sewage processing system as some kind of chemical weapon." "Their sewage processing system?" "Yes, sir. They've modified their waste management facilities to produce and deploy what our chemical analysis identifies as a highly corrosive compound. They're spraying it at our ships while their passengers provide what appears to be entertainment commentary." Vex High felt something that might have been despair if his species were capable of such emotions. "Sub-Commander, how many effective combat vessels do we have remaining?" "Sir, that depends on how you define effective. We have 29 capital ships that are still operational, but..." Rithival paused. "Sir, the humans appear to be adapting their tactics in real time. They're learning from each engagement and sharing information across their entire fleet." "What do you mean?" "Sir, when the agricultural vessel destroyed Hotel Alpha 7, every other ship carrying similar cargo immediately began replicating the tactic. When the research vessel demonstrated kinetic bombardment, Dozens of other vessels began accelerating asteroids. They're not just fighting us, they're teaching each other how to fight us more effectively. On the bridge of the UES Defiance, Dutch watched the tactical display with professional satisfaction. The hegemony fleet was being systematically dismantled by 15,000 civilian vessels, whose crews were apparently having the time of their lives. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Rourke called from his station. "We're receiving status reports from the civilian fleet. Estimated enemy losses are 67% and climbing. Casualties on our side? Surprisingly light, sir. Most of our people are treating this like a really exciting training exercise. Captain Singh reports that his passengers are demanding refunds if the combat ends too quickly. Apparently they paid for a full day of mining operations." Dutch laughed, and there was something in that sound that contained both pride and a kind of terrifying affection for his species. "Rourke, you know what the beautiful thing is about humans?" "Sir? We're the only species in the galaxy that can turn a massacre into a tourist attraction and somehow make it work." The communication from Fleet Commander Vex High came through on all frequencies a few minutes later. It was brief, professional, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had learned something they really wished they hadn't. "Human vessels. This is Fleet Commander Vex High of the Hegemony 4th Fleet. We wish to discuss terms." Dutch looked around his bridge, where his crew was trying very hard not to smile. "Reeves, open a channel. Make sure it's broadcasting to the entire system." "Channel open, sir." "Fleet Commander Vex High, this is Captain Vanderberg. I'm afraid there might be some confusion. You see, you attacked a children's sanctuary. 847 kids. That changes the nature of our relationship considerably." There was a long pause before Vex High responded. "Captain, we are prepared to offer reparations for any unintended collateral damage." "Unintended?" Dutch's voice was very soft. "Commander, you targeted a clearly marked civilian facility. You killed children on purpose. And now you want to negotiate?" "Captain, surely we can reach some accommodation." "Oh, we're going to reach an accommodation, all right," Dutch interrupted. "You're going to surrender your remaining vessels. You're going to turn over complete records of your invasion plans, your fleet movements, and your command structure. And then you're going to deliver a message to your superiors." "What message?" Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that had historically preceded the fall of empires and the rewriting of galactic maps. "The message is this. Humanity is no longer interested in playing by the established rules of galactic civilization. You hurt our children, and that means you've introduced us to a concept called total war. We're going to teach the galaxy what that means. Captain, you cannot seriously intend—" "Commander!" Dutch's voice cut through the transmission like a blade. "Look at your tactical display. Look at what 15,000 civilians with improvised weapons just did to your fleet. Now imagine what humanity can accomplish when we stop being polite." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and substance. It was the silence of someone realizing that they had made a mistake so fundamental that it would require rewriting their understanding of how the universe worked. "Your remaining ships have 10 minutes to power down and prepare for boarding," Dutch continued. "Anyone who objects to this arrangement is welcome to continue the discussion with Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Williams, who are apparently having a wonderful time with their mining equipment." Chapter 11. Lessons in Applied Humanity. The aftermath of what would later be known as the Sol System incident unfolded with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested humans had been planning for this possibility for quite some time. The surrendered hegemony vessels were secured by boarding parties composed primarily of asteroid miners, cargo handlers, and tourists who had paid extra for the authentic military boarding experience. The hegemony crew members, accustomed to inspiring terror in their enemies, found themselves being politely but firmly secured by people who treated interstellar warfare like an elaborate theme park attraction. "Right then," announced Captain Singh as his boarding party secured the hegemony flagship. "Everyone remember to stay with your assigned groups. The ship is quite large and we don't want anyone getting lost. Mrs. Patterson, please stop pointing your mining laser at the prisoners. They've surrendered and it's considered poor form to threaten captives. Mr. Williams, excellent work on that bulkhead cutting, but please remember that we need the command center intact for intelligence purposes." Fleet Commander Vex High, who had conquered 47 star systems and reduced entire civilizations to servitude, found himself being lectured on proper prisoner treatment by a woman who had paid 3,000 credits for what the brochure had advertised as a luxury space adventure with authentic military roleplay elements. "Young man," Mrs. Patterson said, adjusting her mining equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had operated heavy machinery for 6 decades of retirement adventures, "you've been very naughty." Hurting children is simply not acceptable behavior, and I'm quite disappointed in you. Vex High, who had been personally responsible for the deaths of approximately 40 million sentients over his career, found himself mumbling an apology to a grandmother from Earth's Luna colony who apparently collected military experience certificates as a hobby. Admiral Kethvar arrived aboard the Hegemony flagship 3 hours later, accompanied by a full diplomatic team and enough recording equipment to document what the Galactic Council was already calling the most significant military development in galactic history. He found Dutch in what had been Fleet Commander Vex High's command center, reviewing captured intelligence files while surrounded by tourists who were taking pictures with captured enemy equipment. Captain Vanderberg, Kethvar began, his insectoid features tight with what Dutch had learned was a sign of nervous agitation. The Galactic Council is requesting a full report on today's engagement. Dutch looked up from a tactical display that showed complete Hegemony fleet dispositions for the next 6 months. Admiral, I'd be happy to provide a report. What specifically would you like to know? For starters, how did your civilian population coordinate such an effective military response? Our tactical analysts are baffled by the level of organization and strategic thinking we observed. Dutch smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested the answer was both simpler and more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Admiral, humans have been at war with something or someone for our entire recorded history. We've been doing it for so long that we've developed what you might call an institutional memory for conflict. But these were civilians, merchants, tourists, researchers. Were they? Dutch gestured to Captain Singh, who was helping Mrs. Patterson properly secure a Hegemony weapon system. Singh there spent 15 years in the Solar Defense Corps before he started his tour business. Mrs. Patterson was a combat engineer for 30 years before she retired to asteroid mining. Mr. Williams ran a demolitions company before he decided that space tourism was more exciting. Admiral Kethvar was quiet for a moment. Captain, are you telling me that your entire civilian population consists of former military personnel? Not all of them, Dutch admitted. But here's the thing about humans, Admiral. We don't really distinguish between civilian and military the way other species do. We're all part of the same tribe, and when someone threatens the tribe, everyone responds. It doesn't matter if you're officially a soldier or a shopkeeper or a tourist looking for adventure. When human children are in danger, every human becomes a weapon. Dr. Victoria Foster approached from where she had been examining Hegemony scientific equipment with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a particularly interesting research opportunity. Captain, you should see this. Their intelligence files contain detailed assessments of 47 species they've conquered. The consistent pattern is that they identify military assets, neutralize organized resistance, and then impose control over the civilian population. And that worked for them? Perfectly, for every species they've encountered. They assume that if you eliminate the military, the civilians become helpless. They've never encountered a species where the civilians are just off-duty military personnel who happen to have day jobs. Dutch nodded thoughtfully. Doctor, what else do those files tell us about Hegemony operations? Well, they're systematic, methodical, and very, very predictable. They follow the same conquest pattern for every target. Intelligence gathering, fleet deployment, demand for surrender, overwhelming force application, and then occupation with minimal garrison forces. Dr. Victoria Foster paused, consulting her tablet. Captain, according to these files, they have active operations against 17 other systems right now. 17? Yes, sir. All following the same pattern. All assuming that once you defeat the organized military forces, the rest is just administrative cleanup. Dutch was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical displays that showed Hegemony operations across a significant portion of the galaxy. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of thoughtful consideration that usually preceded decisions that changed the course of history. Admiral Kethvar, he said finally, I think it's time the Galactic Council learned something important about humanity. What's that, Captain? We're not just good at defending ourselves. We're very, very good at teaching other people how to defend themselves, too. Chapter 12. The New Curriculum. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 18 hours after the Sol System incident, with representatives from 47 species gathering via holographic link to discuss what everyone was carefully not calling the human problem. Ambassador Veltar stood before the assembly, his chitinous frame reflecting the chamber's lights as he consulted a report that had been classified at the highest possible security level. Behind him, a holographic display showed tactical footage from the battle. 15,000 civilian vessels systematically dismantling one of the galaxy's most feared military forces using improvised weapons and what appeared to be improvised strategies. Honored counselors, Veltar began, his voice carrying the kind of professional calm that came from years of delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. "We have received a complete after-action report from Admiral Kethvar's peacekeeping corps. The situation in the Sol system has evolved." Counselor Thrang of the Methane Worlds raised a sensory stalk. "Ambassador, our preliminary reports suggest that the human defense was successful. Surely this is a positive development." "The defense was indeed successful," Veltar agreed. "However, the manner of that success raises significant concerns about our understanding of human society and capabilities." The holographic display shifted to show footage from inside the captured hegemony vessels, where tourists and retirees were methodically cataloging enemy equipment while providing what appeared to be educational commentary. "The humans did not simply defeat the hegemony fleet," Veltar continued. "They captured intact vessels, seized complete intelligence archives, and are currently conducting what they term detailed analysis of enemy capabilities and operational patterns. They have requested Galactic Council support for what they are calling the Liberation Initiative." Counselor Zeph-Hai of the Crystal Mines spoke next, her crystalline form refracting the chamber light into concerned patterns. "What exactly is this Liberation Initiative?" Veltar consulted his notes with obvious reluctance. "According to Captain Vanderberg, humanity intends to use captured hegemony intelligence to locate and assist other species currently under attack. They have specifically requested permission to, and I quote, teach other civilizations how to turn their civilian populations into highly effective asymmetric warfare assets." The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that occurred when an entire governing body simultaneously realized that their understanding of galactic politics had just become obsolete. "They want to weaponize civilian populations?" Thrang's stalk swiveled toward Veltar with obvious alarm. "Not weaponize," Veltar corrected. "According to their proposal, they want to teach other species how to recognize and utilize existing civilian assets for defensive purposes." Captain Vanderberg was quite specific about this distinction. The holographic display showed more footage from the battle: cargo ships using industrial equipment as weapons, passenger liners deploying improvised chemical agents, research vessels turning scientific instruments into artillery. It looked less like a military engagement and more like the galaxy's most violent industrial accident. "Ambassador," spoke Counselor Yithron of the Gas Giant Collective, "what are the projected implications if humans begin sharing these techniques with other species?" Veltar was quiet for a moment. "Our Strategic Analysis Division has run preliminary models. If humanity's approach to asymmetric warfare were adopted by even a fraction of the galaxy's civilian populations, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Species that currently rely on traditional military structures for defense would become effectively unconquerable. And species that rely on traditional military conquest for expansion would find their operational model completely ineffective." The assembly chamber fell silent again. Through the holographic links, representatives from 47 species contemplated a galaxy where every cargo hauler was a potential weapons platform, and every tourist expedition could become a military operation. Counselor Thrang spoke first. "Ambassador, what is humanity's current position on this matter?" "Captain Vanderberg has requested a formal audience with the Council. He wishes to present what he calls a comprehensive guide to civilian-based defense strategy, and share captured hegemony intelligence with any species currently under threat. And if we decline this request?" Veltar consulted his tablet with the expression of someone who had discovered that their insurance premiums were about to increase dramatically. Captain Vanderberg indicated that humanity would proceed with their liberation initiative regardless of Council approval. He stated, and I quote, "The hegemony hurt human children, and that means we're no longer interested in playing by anyone else's rules. We're going to teach the galaxy how to defend itself whether the Council likes it or not." The silence that followed was punctuated by the soft sounds of 47 representatives simultaneously accessing their species' military capability assessments and wondering if their traditional approaches to defense were about to become as obsolete as stone tools. "When?" asked Counselor Zeph-Hai in a voice that suggested she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. "Does humanity wish to address the Council?" "Captain Vanderberg is en route to Station Harmony aboard a vessel he describes as a diplomatic transport," Veltar replied. "Our sensors indicate it's actually a converted asteroid mining platform carrying approximately 4,000 tons of what their manifest lists as educational materials." "Educational materials?" "Yes, Counselor. Our preliminary scans suggest these materials include detailed technical specifications for improvised weapon systems, tactical manuals for civilian-based resistance operations, and approximately 2,000 different methods for converting standard commercial equipment into military assets. Thrang's stalks drooped in what appeared to be resignation. When will they arrive? 6 hours, Counselor. Then I suggest we prepare for humanity's first formal presentation to the Galactic Council, HFY said with the tone of someone who had realized that the universe was about to become a much more complicated place. Chapter 13. The Lecture Circuit. Captain Dutch Vanderberg stood before the assembled Galactic Council 6 hours later, looking remarkably comfortable for someone who was about to fundamentally alter the course of galactic civilization. Behind him, holographic displays showed technical diagrams, tactical analyses, and what appeared to be a comprehensive breakdown of how to turn a peaceful trading vessel into a weapons platform using nothing more than standard commercial equipment and creative thinking. Honored counselors, Dutch began, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested he had given this presentation before. Thank you for agreeing to this emergency session. I'm here to discuss what humanity calls the democratization of defensive capability. Ambassador Veltar shifted nervously in his seat. Captain Vanderberg, the Council appreciates your enthusiastic approach to system defense. However, we have concerns about the broader implications of your proposed methods. I understand your concerns, Ambassador, Dutch replied with a smile that suggested he understood them perfectly and found them somewhat amusing. But let me ask you a question. How many species in this chamber have lost territory to the hegemony in the last 50 years? A murmur ran through the assembly. Slowly, reluctantly, 17 hands, appendages, and sensory organs were raised. 17 out of 47, Dutch observed. That's 36% of council species who have been directly victimized by an enemy that uses traditional conquest methods against traditional defensive approaches. He gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show a galactic map with hegemony-controlled territories highlighted in red. Now, how many of those 17 species attempted to defend themselves using conventional military assets? All 17 hands remained raised. And how many of those conventional military responses were successful? All 17 hands slowly lowered. Dutch nodded thoughtfully. That's what we call a pattern, counselors. The hegemony has perfected the art of defeating traditional military forces. They know how to identify command structures, neutralize organized resistance, and impose control over civilian populations. It's a very effective system, right up until someone changes the rules. The holographic display shifted to show tactical footage from the Sol system battle. What you're seeing here isn't advanced military technology or superior strategic thinking. What you're seeing is 15,000 civilians who refused to be victims. They used the resources they had available, cargo, equipment, and a willingness to get creative, to solve a problem that conventional military thinking said was unsolvable. Counselor Thrang spoke up, her voice tight with concern. Captain, what you're describing sounds suspiciously like the militarization of civilian populations. The Galactic Accords specifically prohibit the militarization of civilian populations, Dutch interrupted, which is the forced conversion of non-combatants into military assets against their will. That's not what we're talking about here. The display shifted to show personnel files from the Sol system engagement. Captain Singh chose to use his tour business to support system defense. Mrs. Patterson volunteered her mining expertise for military applications. Dr. Foster decided that her research equipment could serve a defensive purpose. Every single civilian who participated in the engagement did so voluntarily. But Captain, interjected Counselor HFY, the result is the same. Civilian populations becoming military assets. Dutch's smile took on a sharper edge. Counselor, with respect, that's where you're wrong. These people didn't become military assets. They revealed that they had always been potential military assets. The only difference is that they had never been threatened before. The holographic display shifted again, showing demographic breakdowns of human-civilian populations. Every species in this chamber assumes that civilian means helpless. But humans don't make that distinction. We're all part of the same survival network. When someone threatens part of that network, the entire network responds. But surely, Veltar said, this approach has limitations. Not every species has humanity's aggressive tendencies. Aggressive tendencies? Dutch laughed, and there was something in that sound that made several council members shift uncomfortably. Ambassador, we're not talking about aggression. We're talking about resourcefulness. Every species in this chamber has civilians who operate complex machinery, handle dangerous materials, and solve logistical problems under pressure. That's not military training, that's basic survival skills. The display showed technical specifications for converting commercial equipment into defensive systems. The Zephyrian Collective operates asteroid mining platforms that can carve up moon-sized rocks. The crystal mines use industrial fabrication systems that can reshape matter at the molecular level. The Gas Giant Collective manages antimatter containment systems as part of their energy infrastructure. Dutch paused, looking around the chamber. Every single species here has civilian capabilities that could be adapted for defensive purposes. You just need someone to teach you how to think about the problem differently. Counselor Yithron spoke up from his position representing the Gas Giant Collective. Captain, are you suggesting that our industrial infrastructure could be repurposed for military applications? I'm suggesting that your industrial infrastructure is already military infrastructure. You just haven't realized it yet. The display shifted to show a breakdown of Gas Giant Collective antimatter facilities. You manage enough antimatter to power half the galaxy. Do you really think the hegemony sees those facilities as civilian targets? When they come for your worlds, and they will come, they're going to treat every antimatter plant as a potential weapons depot. The silence that followed was the kind that occurred when people realized that their entire worldview had just shifted 90 degrees to the left. So here's what humanity is offering, Dutch continued. We'll share everything we learned from the Sol system engagement. Tactical manuals, technical specifications, strategic frameworks, everything you need to turn your existing civilian capabilities into effective defensive assets. We'll provide training, consultation, and operational support. And in return? Asked Thrung. Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that had historically preceded the signing of very important treaties. In return, you help us teach the hegemony why conquest isn't profitable anymore. Chapter 14. The Graduation Ceremony. 6 months later, the Hegemony Fifth Fleet approached the Kepler 442 system with the same methodical confidence that had served them well for 3 centuries of conquest. The system was home to the Aquatic Collective, a peaceful species of amphibious traders who had built their civilization on underwater cities and orbital algae farms. According to Hegemony intelligence, Kepler 442 possessed minimal military assets, a handful of system patrol vessels, some automated defense platforms, and approximately 40,000 civilian vessels engaged in various commercial activities. It should have been a textbook conquest. 2 weeks of strategic bombardment followed by occupation and resource extraction. Fleet Commander Zethmai had personally overseen the successful conquest of 12 systems. He approached each new target with professional detachment and the kind of tactical expertise that came from reducing resistance to a mathematical formula. "Sub-Commander," he called to his aide. "Deploy standard bombardment pattern. Target military installations first, then infrastructure nodes, then population centers until they request terms." "Yes, sir," Sub-Commander Kithnall replied, consulting his tactical displays. "Sir, we're detecting some unusual activity in the system. The civilian traffic appears to be increasing." Zethmai looked up from his strategic assessment with mild interest. "Increasing how?" "Sir, instead of evacuating or seeking shelter, the civilian vessels appear to be moving toward us. Current count is 39,800 vessels on intercept courses." 39,000? Zethmai felt the first stirrings of what humans would recognize as unease. "Are we certain these are civilian vessels?" "Yes, sir." "Our scans identify cargo haulers, passenger transports, research ships, agricultural platforms, and what appears to be a significant number of aquaculture operations." "Aquaculture operations?" "Yes, sir." "Fish farms." "They appear to be moving their underwater agriculture to space-based platforms and approaching our fleet in coordinated formations." Zethmai was quiet for a moment. 6 months earlier, Fleet Commander Vex High had transmitted a disturbing report about something called asymmetric civilian warfare, before his fleet had simply disappeared. The report had been classified at the highest levels, but certain details had filtered down through Hegemony Command. 15,000 civilian vessels, improvised weapons, tactical creativity that defied conventional military analysis. "Sub-Commander, run detailed scans on those approaching vessels. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." "Sir, scanning now." Kithnall's voice took on the careful tone of someone delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. "Sir, we're detecting some unusual cargo configurations." "Unusual how?" "Well, sir, the agricultural platforms appear to be carrying what our chemistry scanners identify as high-yield fertilizers, in quantities that exceed any reasonable farming requirement. The research vessels are showing energy signatures consistent with antimatter containment." "And the fish farms?" Kithnall paused. "Sir, the fish farms appear to have been converted into kinetic weapons platforms." "Fish farms?" "Yes, sir. They've loaded their aquaculture tanks with dense metallic objects and fitted them with magnetic acceleration systems. Our tactical AI estimates they can achieve projectile velocities approaching 15% of light speed. Zethmai stared at his tactical display, watching 39,000 civilian vessels approach his fleet in what was starting to look less like random commercial traffic and more like the most elaborate military formation in galactic history. Sub-Commander, are we detecting any transmissions from the approaching vessels? Yes, sir. They appear to be broadcasting on all frequencies. Kithanal consulted his communications array. Sir, they're singing. Singing? Yes, sir. Our translation AI identifies it as a traditional aquatic collective harmony about, let me get this right, teaching lessons to unwelcome visitors who disturb the peaceful waters. Through the speakers of 39,000 civilian vessels, the aquatic collective's version of a war song echoed through space, not as sound, but as synchronized radio transmissions that created an ethereal harmony audible to anyone listening on the right frequencies. It was beautiful, terrifying, and completely unprecedented. Sir, Kithnal continued, we're also receiving a direct transmission from what appears to be the lead vessel. It's a cargo ship carrying what they list as educational demonstration materials. The transmission crackled through the comm system with the kind of cheerful professionalism usually associated with customer service representatives and people who genuinely enjoyed their work. Hegemony 5th Fleet. This is Captain Reeftal of the aquatic collective vessel Peaceful Learning. We understand you're here to conquer our system. We appreciate your interest, but we're going to have to decline your offer. However, we'd like to demonstrate some techniques we learned from our human friends about creative problem solving. Please observe carefully. There will be a quiz afterward. What followed was a masterclass in applied creativity that made the Sol system engagement look like a practice exercise. The aquatic collective had taken humanity's lessons about asymmetric warfare and adapted them for their own unique capabilities. Their aquaculture platforms, designed for underwater farming, had been converted into mass drivers that could accelerate dense projectiles to velocities that turned cargo into weapons of mass destruction. Their research vessels, equipped with deep-sea exploration technology, deployed pressure weapons that could crush starship hulls like empty bottles. Their passenger transports, built for comfort rather than combat, had been fitted with what the manifest cheerfully described as modified sanitation systems that deployed corrosive compounds with the precision of surgical instruments. But the most devastating weapons came from their cargo vessels, which had been carrying what they listed as traditional food preservation compounds. When Captain Reeftal jettisoned 40,000 tons of salt water into space, and then introduced it to the Hegemony Fleet's hull plating using precisely applied electrical charges, the resulting corrosion was visible from the outer planets. This is a demonstration of accelerated oxidation, Captain Reeftal's voice explained, as Hegemony ships began developing hull breaches at an alarming rate. Please note how the saline solution, when properly applied, can compromise even advanced metallurgy. This technique was developed by our human advisors and adapted for our specific environmental expertise. Fleet Commander Zethmai watched his tactical display with the kind of horrified fascination that came from realizing that everything he thought he knew about warfare had just become obsolete. Sir, Sub-Commander Keithnall called, his voice tight with stress. We've lost 43% of our fleet in the first engagement. Remaining vessels are reporting critical systems failures due to what appears to be coordinated chemical warfare using industrial materials. Chemical warfare? Yes, sir. They're using fish farm saltwater as a corrosive agent, deep-sea pressure systems as kinetic weapons, and what appears to be fermented algae as some kind of biological degradation compound. Our ships are literally dissolving. Zethmai was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical display where his fleet was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that had turned aquaculture into artillery. Sub-Commander, he said finally, signal general retreat. Sir, the Hegemony High Command doesn't authorize retreats from civilian populations. Sub-Commander, Zethmai replied with the calm of someone who had just discovered that military regulations no longer applied to his situation. I don't think this is a civilian population anymore. Chapter 15. The New Normal. The emergency meeting of Hegemony High Command convened 3 days after the Kepler 442 incident, with military leaders from across the Empire gathering to discuss what everyone was carefully not calling the total collapse of traditional conquest doctrine. Supreme Commander Harthvel stood before the assembled War Council, his imposing frame silhouetted against tactical displays that showed the locations of 17 failed conquest attempts in the last 6 months. Each failure had followed the same pattern: overwhelming civilian resistance using improvised weapons and tactical approaches that defied conventional military analysis. Commanders, Harthvel began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from having personally overseen the conquest of 400 star systems. We are facing an unprecedented strategic situation. In the past 6 months, we have lost 7 fleets to what intelligence continues to classify as civilian defensive operations. General Korthan of the 3rd Battle Group raised an appendage. Supreme Commander, our tactical analysis suggests that these are not conventional civilian populations. The level of coordination and tactical sophistication indicates military training and strategic planning. That's exactly the problem, Harthavel replied grimly. They are civilian populations. Our intelligence confirms that these are merchants, farmers, researchers, and tourists. But they're fighting like... He paused, consulting reports that detailed the systematic destruction of hegemony fleets by cargo haulers and fish farms. They're fighting like they've been preparing for war their entire lives. Admiral Zixtar, veteran of the Outer Rim campaigns, spoke next. Supreme Commander, perhaps we need to reconsider our approach. Traditional conquest relies on overwhelming organized military resistance, and then controlling civilian populations. But if the civilian populations are the military resistance, then our entire operational doctrine becomes obsolete. Harthavel finished. Exactly. The holographic display shifted to show footage from the recent engagements. Aquaculture platforms launching kinetic projectiles, research vessels deploying industrial chemicals as weapons, passenger liners using waste management systems for chemical warfare. It looked less like military combat and more like the galaxy's most violent industrial accident. The pattern is consistent across all recent failures, continued Harthavel. The humans appear to be teaching other species their approach to what they call asymmetric civilian warfare. Every species we've encountered in the last 6 months has adapted human techniques to their own capabilities and resources. General Vorthek of the Siege Corps leaned forward. Supreme Commander, what exactly are these human techniques? Harthavel consulted his tactical files with obvious reluctance. According to captured intelligence, the humans operate on the principle that every civilian asset can be converted to military use given sufficient creativity. They don't distinguish between military and civilian infrastructure. They treat everything as potential weapons platforms. Everything? Everything. Cargo ships become kinetic weapons. Industrial equipment becomes artillery. Commercial chemicals become chemical weapons. Tourist vessels become assault platforms. Harthavel paused. They've even weaponized their waste management systems. The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that occurred when military professionals realized that their understanding of warfare had just become fundamentally obsolete. Supreme Commander, Admiral Zixtar said slowly, are you telling us that every civilian in human space is a potential military asset? Not potential, Harthavel corrected. Active. The humans don't have a civilian population in any sense that we understand the term. They have an off-duty military force with day jobs. The implications of this statement rippled through the command chamber like a shockwave. For 3,000 years, the hegemony had built its empire on a simple principle. Identify and destroy organized military resistance, then control helpless civilian populations. But if the civilian populations were the military resistance, what are our options? Asked General Korthan. Harthavel was quiet for a long moment. Our strategic analysis division has identified 3 possible courses of action. First, we can continue current operations and accept casualty rates approaching 90% per engagement. 90%? Yes. Apparently, when you attack civilian populations that are actually disguised military forces, they take it personally. The chamber fell silent again. In the background, status reports from across the Empire painted a picture of systematic failure. 17 conquest operations had been abandoned after encountering civilian resistance that destroyed entire fleets. Supply lines were being disrupted by merchant vessels that turned out to be heavily armed. Even core hegemony territories were reporting commercial shipping incidents that looked suspiciously like military raids. What's the second option? Asked Admiral Zixtar. We could attempt to negotiate with the human-led coalition and establish some kind of peaceful coexistence agreement. The silence that followed this suggestion was different from the earlier silences. It was the kind of silence that occurred when military leaders contemplated the unthinkable. Negotiate, General Vorthek repeated slowly. With civilians. With civilians who destroyed 7 of our fleets using cargo ships and fish farms. Harthavel corrected. Yes. And the third option? Harthavel consulted his files with the expression of someone who had discovered that their insurance premiums were about to increase dramatically. The third option is what our intelligence division calls the learning curve approach. Which is? We attempt to adapt our own civilian populations to human-style asymmetric warfare principles. The chamber erupted in what could generously be called discussion, and more accurately be called barely controlled panic. The idea of teaching hegemony civilians to think like weapons was either brilliant or terrifying, depending on your perspective on galactic stability and the fundamental nature of civilization. "Order!" Harthavel called, and the chamber gradually quieted. "I understand your concerns, but consider the alternative. If we can't adapt to this new form of warfare, we face the prospect of systematic defeat by every species that learns human techniques. And if we do adapt," asked General Corthan, "then we become part of a galaxy where every cargo ship is a potential battlecruiser and every commercial operation is a potential military exercise." Harthavel paused. "Frankly, I'm not sure which option is more terrifying." Chapter 16. The Teachers' Conference. 6 months after the Hegemony High Command meeting, Captain Dutch Vanderberg found himself in a situation that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Standing before a classroom of representatives from 43 species, teaching what the Galactic Council had officially designated as Defensive Resource Optimization Theory, and what everyone else called How to Turn Your Stuff into Weapons 101. The classroom was located aboard Station Harmony, in what had previously been a diplomatic conference center, and was now humanity's first interstellar military academy. The students were an eclectic mix: military officers trying to understand new paradigms, civilian engineers learning to think tactically, and the occasional tourist who had signed up thinking this was some kind of advanced industrial safety course. "Right," Dutch began, standing before a holographic display that showed the basic schematic of a cargo freighter. "Who can tell me what they see when they look at this ship?" Ambassador Veltar, who had somehow ended up enrolled in the course despite his diplomatic status, raised a tentative appendage. "A civilian cargo transport designed for interstellar commerce?" "Wrong," Dutch replied cheerfully. "Anyone else?" Captain Singh, who had been invited as a guest lecturer after his success at Kepler 442, raised his hand. "A kinetic weapons platform with storage capacity, life support systems, and FTL capability." "Exactly." Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that had historically preceded very educational experiences. "Captain Singh understands the fundamental principle of asymmetric resource analysis. Everything is a weapon if you think about it correctly." The holographic display shifted to show tactical modifications. "This cargo freighter has a standard mass of 40,000 tons when fully loaded. At maximum acceleration, it can achieve roughly 12% of light speed. Basic kinetic energy calculation gives us..." Dutch paused, consulting his tablet. "Approximately 4.7 times 10 to the 21st joules of kinetic energy. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to a stellar-class nuclear weapon." A murmur ran through the classroom. Dr. Yithkala of the Crystalline Collective raised what appeared to be a sensory appendage. "Captain Vanderberg, are you suggesting that every cargo ship in the galaxy is essentially a weapon of mass destruction?" "Not suggesting," Dutch corrected. "Stating. Every cargo ship, passenger liner, research vessel, and orbital platform in the galaxy carries enough kinetic energy to level a continent. The only difference between a cargo ship and a strategic weapon is intent and targeting." From the back of the classroom, Commander Reeftal of the Aquatic Collective spoke up. "But Captain, surely there are limitations to this approach. Not every civilian asset can be effectively weaponized." Dutch's grin took on the quality of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. "Commander, you just used fish farms to destroy a hegemony battle fleet. I think your definition of limitations might need some adjustment." The classroom erupted in what could generously be called discussion, and more accurately be called controlled chaos, as representatives from 43 species simultaneously realized that their understanding of civilian infrastructure had just undergone a fundamental revision. "Order!" Dutch called, and the room gradually quieted. "Let's work through some practical examples. Dr. Yithkala, what does your species use for industrial manufacturing?" "Molecular fabrication systems," the crystalline representative replied. "We can reshape matter at the atomic level for construction and artistic purposes." "Excellent. And these systems can work with any type of matter?" "Yes, within certain energy constraints. So theoretically you could use these systems to fabricate..." Dutch paused dramatically. "Let's say, high explosive compounds, kinetic penetrators, armor-piercing projectiles?" Dr. Yithkala was quiet for a moment. Yes, theoretically, but we've never considered..." "Now you're considering it," Dutch interrupted. "That's the first step in asymmetric thinking. Recognizing that the capabilities you have can be applied in ways you've never imagined. The holographic display shifted to show industrial fabrication systems being retrofitted for military applications. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it doesn't require building new weapons. You're not militarizing your civilian population. You're recognizing that your civilian population already has military capabilities. Ambassador Veltar spoke up, his voice tight with what might have been concern. Captain, isn't this approach somewhat dangerous? If every civilian asset becomes a potential weapon, then every civilian becomes responsible for their own defense, Dutch finished. Ambassador, the old system assumed that civilians were helpless and needed military protection. But what if civilians aren't helpless? What if they're just untrained? The classroom fell silent as 43 species contemplated a galaxy, where the distinction between military and civilian had become largely meaningless. But Captain, came a voice from the middle of the classroom, Lieutenant Korthtel of the Methane Worlds. This approach seems to assume that all civilian populations have what's the human term? The aggressive instincts necessary for combat operations. Dutch was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Lieutenant, let me ask you something. If someone threatened your family, what would you do? I would defend them, of course. Using what? Whatever was available. Exactly. You wouldn't limit yourself to designated weapons or approved tactics. You'd use whatever worked. Dutch gestured to the tactical displays. That's not aggression, Lieutenant. That's protection. And every species in this room has populations that understand protection. The holographic display shifted to show tactical analyses from recent engagements. The aquatic collective used aquaculture because that's what they knew. The crystalline mines will use molecular fabrication because that's their expertise. The methane worlds will probably use atmospheric processing systems because that's what they're good at. Atmospheric processing? Lieutenant Korthtel asked. Your species manages atmospheric chemistry for entire worlds. You manipulate gas compositions on a planetary scale. Do you really think hostile forces don't see those capabilities as potential weapons? The silence that followed was the kind that occurred when people realized that their peaceful infrastructure might not be as peaceful as they had thought. So here's the core principle, Dutch continued. Every civilian capability can be adapted for defensive purposes. The question isn't whether you can weaponize your infrastructure. It's whether you're willing to learn how to do it effectively. From the front row, Captain Singh raised his hand. Captain, what about species that genuinely lack aggressive instincts? Not every civilization has humanity's enthusiasm for conflict. Dutch smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested the answer was both simpler and more complex than anyone expected. Captain, you're making the same mistake everyone makes. You're assuming this is about aggression, but it's not about being aggressive. It's about being creative. The holographic display showed footage from the Sol system engagement. Tourists operating mining equipment against enemy vessels, retirees using industrial tools for military purposes, scientists repurposing research equipment for tactical applications. Look at these people, Dutch said. Half of them had never seen combat before that day, but they were creative problem solvers who understood their equipment and were motivated to protect their homes. That's not military training. That's basic survival instinct combined with technical competence. So you're saying that any sufficiently advanced civilian population is indistinguishable from a military force? Asked Dr. Yithkala. Dutch's grin was the kind of expression that had historically preceded the signing of very important historical documents. Doctor, I'm saying that any sufficiently motivated civilian population is a military force. They just don't know it yet. Chapter 17, Final Examinations. 1 year after the Sol system incident, the galaxy had settled into what historians would later call the new equilibrium. The hegemony, faced with the prospect of fighting wars against entire civilizations rather than military forces, had reluctantly agreed to what the Galactic Council diplomatically termed comprehensive peace negotiations, and what everyone else called unconditional surrender. The negotiations took place aboard Station Harmony, in chambers that had been hastily expanded to accommodate representatives from what was now being called the Defensive Alliance, a coalition of species that had adopted human-style asymmetric warfare techniques and discovered that they really enjoyed not being conquerable. Supreme Commander Harthvel sat across from Captain Dutch Vanderberg in what had to be the most surreal diplomatic meeting in galactic history. Between them lay documents that formally ended 3,000 years of hegemony expansion and established what the treaty carefully called mutual recognition of civilian defensive capabilities. Captain Vanderberg, Harthvel began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had spent the last year discovering that everything he thought he knew about warfare was wrong. The Hegemony Council has authorized me to accept the terms of the proposed peace agreement. Dutch nodded thoughtfully. Supreme Commander, I appreciate your council's flexibility in this matter. I'm sure this represents a significant adjustment to your traditional operational approaches. That, Harthavel replied with what might have been humor if his species were capable of such emotions, is something of an understatement. The treaty was comprehensive, detailed, and absolutely revolutionary in its implications. The hegemony agreed to withdraw from all occupied territories, provide reparations for conquest damages, and, perhaps most importantly, submit to what the document called civilian defensive capability assessments to ensure they couldn't resume their old habits. Supreme Commander, Dutch said, consulting the treaty documents, there is one additional matter we need to discuss. Which is? The hegemony's own civilian population. Our analysis suggests that your people have significant untapped defensive potential. Harthavel was quiet for a moment. Captain, are you suggesting that we apply your techniques to our own civilian infrastructure? I'm suggesting that your civilian infrastructure already has military applications. You just need to learn how to recognize them. Dutch smiled. After all, Supreme Commander, peace is much more stable when everyone involved is equally capable of defending themselves. The holographic display activated, showing technical analyses of hegemony civilian capabilities. Your species operates massive industrial complexes, manages planetary engineering projects, and maintains one of the galaxy's most sophisticated logistics networks. From a defensive standpoint, you're already incredibly well equipped. But we've never considered— Now you're considering it, Dutch interrupted with the same words he'd used in countless classroom discussions. That's the beautiful thing about this approach, Supreme Commander. It's not about becoming more aggressive. It's about becoming more secure. The treaty signing ceremony took place 6 hours later, with representatives from 87 species gathering to witness what everyone agreed was either the beginning of a new era of galactic peace or the formalization of the most dangerous military doctrine in cosmic history. Ambassador Veltar stood before the assembly, his chitinous frame reflecting the chamber's lights as he prepared to make what would probably be the most important diplomatic statement of his career. Honored representatives, Veltar began. Today we formalize an agreement that fundamentally alters the nature of galactic civilization. For the first time in recorded history, we have achieved a stable peace not through the balance of military forces, but through the recognition that military force is no longer the exclusive domain of military organizations. The treaty was signed by representatives from 87 species, creating what the document officially called the Galactic Mutual Defense and Education Alliance, and what everyone else was already calling the galaxy's most heavily armed civilian population. As the ceremony concluded, Dutch found himself standing next to Admiral Kethvar, who had somehow ended up as the Alliance's first military liaison despite the fact that traditional military forces were now largely irrelevant. Captain, Kethvar said, his insectoid features showing what Dutch had learned was amusement. I have to ask, did you plan this? Plan what, Admiral? This entire transformation, the end of traditional conquest, the militarization of civilian populations, the fundamental restructuring of galactic power dynamics. Dutch was quiet for a moment, looking out at the representatives from 87 species who were engaged in animated discussions about industrial chemistry, kinetic energy calculations, and the proper use of agricultural equipment for defensive purposes. Admiral, he said finally, we didn't plan this. We just responded to a threat using the resources we had available. Everything else. He gestured to the diplomatic chaos around them. Everything else was just the galaxy learning what humans have always known. Which is? Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that contained both pride and a certain fondness for his species' approach to solving problems. That there's no such thing as a non-military target if you think about it creatively enough. Epilogue. The new curriculum. 5 years after the Sol System incident, Captain Dutch Vanderberg stood in the observation deck of the UES Defiance, watching the construction of what would eventually become the galaxy's first civilian defense university. The massive station was being built by a consortium of 87 species, each contributing their own expertise to what was essentially a giant educational facility dedicated to teaching people how to turn their day jobs into defensive capabilities. Sir, Communications Officer Reeves called from her station. We're receiving a transmission from the New Geneva Memorial Children's Sanctuary. Dutch turned from the viewport, his expression softening. The new sanctuary had been built in the asteroid belt, with defensive capabilities that made it simultaneously the safest and most heavily fortified children's facility in galactic history. It was protected by a network of civilian vessels that included converted cargo haulers, repurposed research platforms, and what the manifest cheerfully listed as educational demonstration units. "Put it through, Reeves." The transmission crackled through the comm system with the voices of children, human, aquatic collective, crystalline mind, and dozens of other species, singing what had become known as the Defender's Song. It was a simple melody about protecting families and standing together, and it had somehow become the unofficial anthem of the Galactic Defense Alliance. "Captain," came the voice of Director Martinez, who ran the new sanctuary. "The children wanted to send you their quarterly report. Academic performance is excellent. Recreational activities are proceeding according to schedule, and the older students have successfully completed their basic defensive systems course." Dutch smiled. The defensive systems course was something that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Children learning how to operate industrial equipment, understand basic chemistry, and think tactically about resource utilization. It wasn't military training in any traditional sense, but it was education that ensured the next generation would never be helpless. "Also," Director Martinez continued, "the students wanted to let you know that they've been working on a special project. They've designed what they call an improved agricultural distribution system that they think might have applications beyond farming." Dutch felt a familiar sense of pride mixed with mild alarm. Human children who had been taught to think creatively about defensive applications were apparently maintaining the species' tradition of weaponizing everything they touched. "Should I be concerned about this agricultural distribution system?" he asked. "Oh, probably," Director Martinez replied cheerfully. "But they're very excited about it, and their math is excellent. They've calculated yield ratios, distribution patterns, and what they term optimal deployment scenarios. Their physics teacher is very impressed." Dutch laughed, and the sound contained both affection and a certain resigned acceptance of his species' approach to education. "Tell them we look forward to seeing their presentation." As the transmission ended, Dutch returned to the viewport, watching the construction of humanity's latest contribution to galactic civilization, a university dedicated to teaching the fine art of creative problem-solving in potentially hostile environments. "Sir?" Lieutenant Commander Rourke called from his station. "We're receiving requests from 17 more systems asking for defensive consultation services. Apparently, word is spreading about our educational programs." "Educational programs?" Dutch repeated with amusement. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Well, sir, technically we are teaching people how to use their existing resources more effectively. It's definitely education. Education in applied creative destruction." "The best kind of education, sir." Dutch nodded, watching as ships from across the galaxy delivered materials for the university construction. Cargo haulers that could double as kinetic weapons, passenger liners equipped with defensive chemistry labs, research vessels that served as mobile tactical platforms. It was, by any reasonable standard, the most dangerous construction project in galactic history. It was also, Dutch reflected, probably the most peaceful the galaxy had been in millennia. When everyone was equally capable of defending themselves, when every civilian population was effectively a potential military force, when conquest became economically and tactically impractical, warfare tended to become obsolete. "Rourke," Dutch said finally, "set course for the Outer Rim. I understand there's a species out there called the Pastoral Collective that thinks they're too peaceful to learn defensive techniques." "Too peaceful, sir?" Dutch's smile was the kind of expression that had historically preceded very educational experiences for everyone involved. "That's what they think. But I bet they operate some kind of agriculture, manage some kind of industry, and care about protecting their families." "And that's enough?" "Rourke, my friend, that's everything. Caring about protection plus available resources plus creative thinking equals defensive capability. Everything else is just technical details." As the UES Defiance turned toward the Outer Rim, Dutch reflected on what humanity had accomplished in 5 short years. They hadn't set out to revolutionize galactic civilization or end the age of military conquest. They had simply responded to a threat using the resources they had available and the principles they had always lived by. Protect the family, use what works, and never assume that something can't be weaponized until you've really tried. The fact that this approach had accidentally created the most stable peace in galactic history was, Dutch supposed, just another example of humanity's peculiar talent for solving problems in ways that nobody expected. In the distance, the lights of 87 civilizations twinkled against the cosmic dark. Merchants and farmers and researchers and tourists, all going about their daily business of building, creating, exploring, and learning. And all of them, whether they realized it or not, maintaining the galaxy's most effective defense network simply by being good at their jobs and caring about their communities. It was, Dutch thought, A pretty good outcome for a species that had started this whole adventure by asking if anyone wanted to buy some really excellent fireworks. Some things, he reflected, never changed. Humans would always be the universe's favorite dangerous idiots, turning peaceful activities into potential weapons, and somehow making it work out for everyone involved. And the galaxy, despite itself, was probably better off for it. The end, author's note. This story explores the classic HFY theme of human ingenuity and determination, while examining what happens when our species' particular brand of creative problem-solving becomes a teachable skill. Sometimes the best defense is a good education, especially when that education involves learning to look at everyday tools and resources with a slightly different perspective. The New Geneva Children's Sanctuary stands as a reminder that some things are worth protecting at any cost, and that sometimes the most effective response to aggression is to ensure that it simply stops being profitable. In memory of all those who protect the vulnerable, in whatever form that protection takes.